The wind, a lonely thing, spoke a language of grit and sorrow, whispering through the splintered bones of the cabin. It was a home only in name, a husk held together by stubbornness and memory, much like the woman who haunted its rooms. Mai lived inside the silence, a space carved out by a pain so old it had become part of the architecture. The floorboards groaned with the weight of her solitude, and the single window, clouded with the dust of seasons, looked out onto a world that had long forgotten her. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, pregnant with a storm that mirrored the one perpetually raging behind her eyes. Each gust of wind that rattled the door was a ghost's knock, a reminder of what was lost. But this sound was different. It was solid. Real. A heavy, deliberate thud that cut through the symphony of the approaching tempest. Fear, a cold, unfamiliar serpent, coiled in her stomach. No one came here. The path had been reclaimed by stubborn weeds years ago, a testament to her desire to be swallowed by the prairie. She held her breath, her hand flying to the worn handle of a fireplace poker. The knock came again, patient but firm, a sound that did not belong in her world of decay. It was the sound of something new, and in Mai's life, new things were rarely good. Peering through a crack in the warped door frame, she saw only a shape, a silhouette vast enough to block out the dying light, a mountain of a man standing on her broken porch. She opened the door a sliver, the iron poker held tight behind her back, its cold weight a small comfort against the frantic beating of her heart. The man was larger than she had imagined, his shoulders a bulwark against the wind that whipped his long duster coat. He filled the doorway, his presence shrinking the already small cabin into a doll's house. His face, half hidden by a rain-soaked hat and a thick beard, was a landscape of its own, carved with lines of hardship but absent the cruelty she was conditioned to expect. "You're bigger than my cabin," she heard herself say, the words escaping like a startled bird, thin and brittle. He didn't laugh. He simply removed his hat, revealing tired eyes the color of a winter sky, and nodded slowly. His first words were not a demand or a threat, but a request as quiet as falling snow, a sound swallowed almost immediately by the wind's howl. "Storm's coming," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in the very foundations of the broken home. "Asking for shelter." Not charity. He held up his hands, large and calloused, showing they were empty. It was this gesture, this admission of need from a man so immense, that made her freeze. It was a vulnerability she hadn't seen in a man's eyes since her father. Her gaze fell to the leaking roof, where a steady drip was already beginning to form a puddle on the floor, a constant, nagging reminder of all the things she couldn't fix. This giant, this stranger, was asking for shelter in a place that could barely shelter itself. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth, yet something in his quiet gaze held her captive, a silent plea that spoke to the part of her she thought had long since turned to dust. The storm broke with the fury of a betrayed god, its tears lashing against the thin walls of the cabin. Inside, the silence was a fragile truce between two wounded souls. The stranger, who called himself Arthur, sat on a crate because Mai's only chair looked as if it would crumble under his weight. He didn't speak, but his presence was a constant, solid thing in the flickering firelight. He watched the water drip from the ceiling into a tin pot, the rhythmic plinking a sad little song of disrepair. He saw the rot in the beams, the cracks in the chinking, the way the wind found its way through a dozen unseen holes to stir the embers in the hearth. Yet, his gaze held no judgment, only a deep, abiding quiet. Mai watched him from the shadows, the poker never far from her hand. She had lived with the ghosts of men who took, who broke, who saw weakness as an invitation. But Arthur simply was. He took up space, yet he seemed to demand none. The firelight carved shadows and hollows onto his face, and in them, she saw a weariness that felt ancient, a sorrow that recognized her own. He had not asked for food, though he looked hungry. He had not asked for warmth, though he had shivered when he first came in. He had only asked for shelter, a word that echoed in the barren corners of her heart. Was this not what she had been seeking all along? A place to hide from the world, from the memory of a cruel voice and a heavy hand. This cabin, this broken shell, was her shelter, and now, for one night, she was sharing it. When dawn broke, it was a fragile promise filtering through the grimy window pane. The world outside was washed clean, glistening and battered from the storm's passage. A large branch from the lone cottonwood tree had fallen, narrowly missing the roof. Arthur was already outside when Mai emerged, the morning air cold and sharp in her lungs. He stood looking up at the roof, his expression thoughtful. He didn't ask. He simply picked up a fallen length of wood, tested its weight, and began the slow, methodical work of clearing the debris. Mai watched from the doorway, a mug of weak chicory coffee warming her hands. She expected him to leave, to continue on his way, his debt for a night's shelter paid. But he stayed. He found her father's old tools, rusted but serviceable, in the dilapidated shed. He moved with a quiet economy, his large hands surprisingly deft as he began to assess the damage to the roof. "Got any spare shingles?" he asked, his first words of the day. She shook her head, feeling a familiar pang of inadequacy. "Plank of wood will do," he said, not looking at her. For now he climbed onto the roof with a grace that defied his size, and the sound of his hammer began to echo across the clearing. It was not the angry, destructive sound of her past, but a rhythmic, constructive beat. Thump. 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 It was the sound of something broken being mended, and it was a music her soul had not heard in a very long time. Days bled into a week, each one marked by the steady rhythm of Arthur's hammer. He mended the roof, then he straightened the sagging porch, replacing the rotted step that had tripped her more times than she could count. He worked without fanfare, expecting no thanks, seeming to find a quiet purpose in the act of restoration itself. He was rebuilding her world, one nail at a time. Mai found herself watching him, the initial fear slowly dissolving into a cautious curiosity. She noticed the long, faded scar that snaked across the back of his left hand, a pale river on a landscape of callices. One evening, as the setting sun painted the prairie in hues of gold and rose, she brought him a bowl of thin stew. They ate in their usual silence by the fire. "Your hand," she said, her voice small. "How did it happen?" Arthur stopped eating, his gaze distant as he stared at the scar. "A misunderstanding," he said, the words heavy with unspoken history. "Someone thought they owned something that wanted to be free." He looked at her then, his winter sky eyes holding a profound understanding. He set his bowl aside and picked up a piece of scrap wood. With a small knife, he began to carve, the shavings falling like soft snow onto the hearth. He didn't speak again, but as she watched the shape of a small, delicate songbird emerge from the rough wood, she felt a profound connection, a shared language of being misunderstood, of wanting to be free. The cabin was warmer now, not just from the sealed cracks, but from this new, fragile thing growing between them. The songbird he carved sat on the windowsill, its silent, wooden form a sentinel of the change that had taken root. Inspired by the mended porch and the secure roof, Mai found herself pulling weeds from the choked garden patch. Her fingers, at first clumsy, rediscovered the familiar feel of soil, the promise of life dormant beneath the surface. For the first time in years, she planted seeds. It was a small act of faith, a quiet declaration that she believed in a future, in a tomorrow. Arthur had fixed the gate, and now it swung open without a mournful creak. The path to the cabin was clear. The house no longer looked like a wounded animal hiding in the brush, it was beginning to look like a home. One afternoon, while mending a fence line, Arthur began to hum, a low, rumbling melody that vibrated in the warm air. Mai, kneeling in the garden, felt the sound settle over her like a warm blanket. A genuine smile, small and shy, touched her lips. It felt foreign, an unfamiliar muscle awakening after a long slumber. He saw it, and his humming hitched for a moment before continuing, a little stronger this time. The world felt bigger, brighter. The constant, dull ache in her chest had eased, replaced by a tentative, fluttering hope. But hope, she knew, was a fragile thing. And the prairie held long memories. She did not see the figure watching from the ridgeline, a silhouette of a man whose shadow had once been long enough to darken her entire world. The shift was as sudden as a change in the wind. One moment, the air was filled with the scent of tilled earth and sun-warmed pine. The next, it was thick with a familiar, metallic tang of dread. Mai was drawing water from the well when she saw him, a distant rider approaching not with the weary pace of a traveler, but with the arrogant certainty of a landlord. Her blood ran cold. The bucket slipped from her grasp, clattering against the stone, the sound unnervously loud in the sudden silence. It was Flint. The name itself was a curse on her lips, a name she hadn't dared to speak aloud for years. He was the unresolved past, the architect of her solitude. Arthur, sensing the change in her, came to stand beside her, his large frame a silent question. As Flint drew closer, his features sharpened into a cruel smirk. He was handsome in a predatory way, his clothes too fine for the prairie, his eyes missing the warmth that resided in Arthur's. He dismounted, his gaze sweeping over the repaired cabin, the cleared garden, the mended fence. A flicker of possessive anger crossed his face. "Well, well," Flint said, his voice a silken threat. "Playing house, are we?" "You've been busy." He ignored Arthur completely, his eyes fixed on Mai, stripping her bare of the fragile peace she had so carefully cultivated. "Did you forget this land is mine, little bird? Did you forget that everything on it, including you, belongs to me?" "She belongs to no one." Arthur's voice was low and steady, a bedrock against Flint's tide of venom. Flint finally turned to him, his eyes narrowing as he took in Arthur's size, dismissing it with a sneer. "And who is this?" "Some stray you took in," he directed at Mai, his tone dripping with contempt. "I leave you for a season and you collect beasts of burden." He took a step towards Mai, his hand reaching out as if to touch her cheek. Mai flinched back, a movement so ingrained it was instinct. In that small action, Arthur saw years of terror. "This is my home," Mai said, her voice trembling but holding a new, steely edge she didn't know she possessed. It was the house speaking through her, the repaired walls, the solid roof. "You are not welcome here." Flint laughed, a cold, ugly sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Your home? This shack? I let you stay here out of pity, Mai. Because I knew you couldn't survive without me. You're broken. Who else would have you?" Every word was a carefully aimed dart, designed to shatter her newfound strength. He was trying to rebuild the prison of her past around her, brick by venomous brick. But this time, she was not alone in it. Arthur stepped forward slightly, not aggressively, but enough to place himself between them. "The lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice still quiet, but now it carried the weight of a coming storm. The air crackled with tension, a moral confrontation on the threshold of a home built on second chances. The prairie held its breath. The confrontation tightened like a knot, the space between the three of them charged with years of pain and a few weeks of hope. "You think this giant can protect you?" Flint spat, his charming facade cracking to reveal the raw ugliness beneath. "He'll leave. They always leave. And you'll be alone again." In the dark he lunged, not for Arthur, but for Mai, grabbing her arm. His touch was like ice, a venomous cold that threatened to extinguish the small flame of courage inside her. "We're leaving," he snarled, trying to drag her towards his horse. But Mai planted her feet. She looked at her garden, at the solid porch, at the face of the man who had shown her that kindness was not a weakness. She found her voice. No, it was a single word, but it was imbued with the strength of every nail Arthur had hammered, every weed she had pulled. It was the strongest thing she had ever said. Enraged by her defiance, Flint raised his hand to strike her. The world slowed. The blow never landed. Arthur's hand shot out, catching Flint's wrist in a grip of iron. The size difference was suddenly, starkly apparent. Flint struggled, his face contorting in pain and disbelief. "Let go of me, you brute," he hissed. Arthur's eyes, usually so gentle, were now chips of ice. "You bring nothing but blight," he said, his voice a low growl. With a powerful shove, he sent Flint stumbling backward. Flint tripped over the very porch step Arthur had repaired, landing hard in the dust. Defeated, humiliated, and staring up at the two people who had built a fortress he could not breach, he scrambled to his feet, mounted his horse, and fled, a spectre of the past banished by the light. In the aftermath, a profound quiet descended, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the cottonwood leaves. The storm had passed. Sunlight, clear and golden, spilled over the prairie, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Mai stood trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer force of her own liberation. The bruises Flint had left on her arm were already beginning to form, but they felt different from the old ones. These were marks of a battle won, not a silent submission. Arthur gently took her arm, his touch infinitely careful, and examined the marks. He said nothing, but his eyes were filled with a deep, sorrowful anger on her behalf. In that moment, the last of her walls crumbled. Tears she hadn't shed in years streamed down her face, tears of grief, of relief, of a catharsis so powerful it shook her to the core. He did not try to stop them. He simply stood with her, a silent, steadfast guardian, until the weeping subsided. As she wiped her eyes, her gaze lifted towards the horizon, and she saw a figure walking towards them. It was a young man, thin and weary, but his walk was determined. A gasp escaped her lips. It couldn't be. The face, older and etched with its own hardships, was one she had only seen in her dreams. Lee, she whispered, the name a fragile prayer. Her brother, whom Flint had driven off and told her was lost forever, was walking towards her. He had heard whispers that Flint's power was broken, and he had come home. The repaired shelter, defended and sanctified, was now, finally, a complete and true home. The cabin glowed in the late afternoon sun, a beacon of warmth and resilience on the vast prairie. Laughter, a sound it had not known for a very long time, now spilled from its open door. Inside, the small wooden bird sat on the mantel, watching over a new kind of family. Arthur and Lee sat at a small, sturdy table Arthur had built, sharing a simple meal. The stew was no longer thin, but rich with vegetables from Mai's thriving garden. Lee spoke of his years away, the hardships he had faced, and the unyielding hope of finding his sister again. Mai spoke of the long, quiet years, and of the giant stranger who arrived in a storm and taught her how to rebuild not just a house, but a life. Arthur, as always, said little, but his quiet presence was a gentle anchor for them all, his gaze soft as he watched the siblings rediscover one another. The house was no longer a husk, a monument to sorrow. It was alive, breathing with the rhythm of its inhabitants. It was a testament to the fact that what is broken can be mended, that what is lost can be found, and that the deepest wounds can be healed by an unexpected kindness. The structure was no longer just a shelter from the storm, but a home, a place built not of wood and nails, but of courage, resilience, and love. What does home truly mean to you? Is it a place, a person, or a feeling of safety? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more.